Seeking thrills, the two parked their car in a deserted, isolated suburban area. Meanwhile, not far from them, a dark figure was slowly approaching. This was a horrific, nightmarish case in Italy, with the longest investigation, the highest cost, and the largest number of police officers deployed. Upon receiving the report, the police immediately sealed off the scene. The prosecutor used tweezers to pick up the remaining eggshell fragments. This was the fourth murder in recent years. The victims were all couples seeking thrills. The killer specifically targeted women. After firing the final shot, he would drag the body out and dismember it as a trophy. However, unlike previous cases, this time a witness inadvertently interrupted the killer's plan. Unfortunately, they still did not see the killer's face. Just as the prosecutor and police were discussing the case, a small car slowly drove through the crowd. Inside were the victim's parents. Tears welled up in their empty eyes. Their faces were rigid as they listened to the report of their daughter's death. The prosecutor returned to his office and flipped through the old files. The first murder had occurred in September 1974. After shooting the young man, the killer stabbed the girl 96 times with a dagger. The second case occurred in June 1981. After killing the young man in a similar manner, the killer mutilated the girl's lower body. 4 months later, a third case occurred, completely replicating the method of the second. And tonight, in June 1982, less than a year later, the killer struck again. What the prosecutor found at the scene was a .22 caliber Beretta pistol bullet, the same type of bullet that had been used to kill the 6 previous victims. Police checked Beretta's sales records and found that thousands of people had purchased this type of gun. Therefore, they were temporarily unable to identify a suspect. However, from this clue, prosecutors discovered in old records that a couple had been murdered in 1968. At that time, the husband of the female victim confessed to killing his wife and her lover. The murder weapon was a Beretta. Furthermore, after the crime, the gun disappeared. Prosecutors speculated that the weapon from that case had likely fallen into the hands of the current perpetrator, who was continuing to use it to commit crimes. The husband from that case was currently living in a heavily guarded hospital room. When police first approached him, he immediately refused to speak. Several lawyers cited his extremely serious condition as a reason to prevent questioning. However, the police did not give up. They visited him repeatedly, even showing him pictures of the 4 recent serial murders. Seeing the victim's eyes wide open in death, he couldn't control his emotions and turned away. Noticing his emotional turmoil, the police patiently reassured him, saying that he had been in his hospital room at the time of the murders and therefore couldn't possibly be the killer. They only hoped he could recall the case involving his wife from years ago to assist in the investigation. In 1959, Stefano lived in a village near Florence and was forced into marriage by his family. However, neither he nor Barbara were happy with this arranged marriage. Barbara ran away in her wedding dress, and Stefano had no intention of chasing after her. Ultimately, Stefano's brother led a search party throughout the village and forcibly tied Barbara up to complete the wedding. For the first 2 years of their marriage, they could only choose to accept their fate. In the early days of their marriage, they were considered a couple who respected each other. But since they moved out on their own, their financial situation has deteriorated. Stefano's salary is no longer enough to cover basic living expenses. So, he came up with an idea: renting a room in the house for 3,000 lira a month. Even on their first meeting, the atmosphere was incredibly strange. They were clearly discussing renting a room, but the tenant's eyes were fixed on Barbara. After he moved in for 2 months, Barbara could only endure it silently. She took a bottle of brandy from the cabinet, tried to appear calm, and poured him a full glass, as if that composure could mask her inner fear. Not only that, when he went to shower, her gaze remained fixed on the light emanating from the bathroom. Stefano, standing beside her, cowardly pretended not to notice. He simply smoked in silence. This silence fueled the tenant's wicked thoughts. Just as the couple were about to go to bed, he blocked the doorway, turned up the volume of the music in the living room, and brazenly walked into the bedroom. Stefano heard his wife's almost desperate screams and, summoning his courage, rushed to the door. His hand hovered over the doorknob. He hesitated for a moment, then ultimately chose to give up. 4 months later, Barbara announced the shocking news at the dinner table. She was 4 months pregnant. She thought the child must have been conceived around that time. Stefano knew he had no right to question anything, so he could only silently accept the truth. They understood each other implicitly and continued to maintain the facade of a normal married couple. Years passed in silence. Once, Stefano brought a colleague from the construction site home, offering to use the restroom. This man was the younger brother of their tenant, but he seemed much gentler. He not only shook Barbara's hand and greeted her warmly, but also kindly inquired about her adorable son. When Barbara took her son inside and came back out, she nearly bumped into him. The moment their eyes met made Stefano feel extremely uncomfortable. Stefano told the police that from the first day he brought his colleague home, Barbara had been having an affair with him. After he was imprisoned, Barbara quickly developed a relationship with a new lover. News soon reached his family, who pressured Stefano to quickly clarify the shameful affair. But Stefano, being weak-willed, dared not speak in front of Barbara. One night in 1968, the lover came to the house to take Barbara to the movies. His son didn't want to be home and face his father. Stefano, who was usually soft-hearted, became irritable towards someone weaker than himself. In the end, he could only watch them leave. Barbara, meanwhile, was almost grinding her teeth in anger. It was at this point in his life that the rage he had been trying to suppress for so long suddenly erupted. His legs trembled uncontrollably as if to calm his emotions. He refused to answer any further questions from the police. The old police officer who had handled the case years ago still remembered what happened afterward very clearly. According to his son Stefano, around 11 o'clock that night, the three of them went to the movie theater. After the boring film ended, the boy was so sleepy he could barely keep his eyes open. Barbara lifted him into the back seat of the car. In a semi-conscious state, he vaguely saw the car stop in a deserted field on the outskirts of town. Barbara and her lover switched places. Just as they were about to satisfy their sexual needs, he was awakened. At that moment, he discovered that both of them were no longer breathing. In panic, he repeatedly honked the horn for help, but no one answered in the empty field. In the reeds beside the car, there were rustling sounds as if someone had just passed by. He opened the car door and, wearing only socks, stepped onto the gravel road. He cautiously groped his way through the darkness for an unknown amount of time before finally seeing the faint lights of a residential area. After the police received the report, they took him to the station. Strangely, despite having just witnessed a murder, the boy remained unusually calm. He also claimed that he had walked for over 10 minutes before finding someone to ask for help. However, the socks supposedly worn on the gravel road showed not a single tear. Considering the boy was too young, the police didn't press the matter further, only summoning Stefano and Barbara's former lover. Both were questioned. Afterward, the police instructed them to remain in the area. Stefano then took his son home. The family immediately held an emergency meeting to discuss how to protect their family's reputation. Before the forensic results were announced, Stefano, accompanied by his relatives, returned to the police station. The moment he spoke, everyone was shocked. The police immediately took Stefano back to the scene to reenact the crime. He deliberately acted violently and mimicked how he had murdered his wife and her lover the night before. However, the police still discovered subtle flaws in his seemingly flawless performance. Stefano described Barbara lying completely on top of her lover, but when the police examined the crime scene, her hips were clearly still in the driver's seat. Hearing this, Stefano quickly adjusted the postures of the two police officers who were impersonating the body. The police added another point of suspicion. Stefano had no means of transportation. The crime scene in the suburbs was several kilometers from his house to the hospital. Without an accomplice, it would be absolutely impossible to get there on foot. Therefore, the police speculated that the murder weapon was most likely provided by an accomplice. Seeing that Stefano still refused to reveal any information, the police had to turn to questioning his son. The gravel road in that area was rough and sharp, so why was the child walking in socks on the night of the murder without a single scratch? After all, he was just a child. He had been pressured by the police and was mentally disturbed, revealing the whole truth about the previous night. In fact, after the boy honked the horn for a while, Stefano appeared beside the car and hugged him tightly. At the same time, another dark figure vaguely appeared in the darkness. With this clue, the police immediately interrogated Stefano, who was being held in custody. They realized that Stefano had fabricated a complete story and forced his son to recount it exactly as he wished to inform the person who discovered the incident and the police. However, despite the solid evidence, Stefano still refused to reveal the whereabouts of his accomplice. The police had no other choice but to close the case quickly. In the end, they could only let Stefano bear all the charges and sentenced him to 30 years in prison. At that time, in 1982, the police thought they would not be able to get any more clues from him. But that evening, Stefano proactively requested to see his son one last time. He was willing willing to confess the whole truth he had been hiding and hoped to solve the case. So the police immediately went to his son. Separated by the cold walls of prison for 13 years, the father and son finally had the chance to reunite. Stefano's legs trembled as he approached. They embraced for the first time in years and spoke frankly. Stefano kept his promise and confessed everything he knew. His accomplice that night was his colleague. This colleague, resentful of Barbara ending their relationship and provoked by the appearance of a new lover, chose to kill to vent his anger. Afterward, they both taught Stefano's son a complete confession to escape punishment. At the same time, the colleague took the boy to seek help. This colleague, having committed numerous armed robberies, was skilled at avoiding gunpowder residue tests. Adding to this, his wife had helped create an alibi, so the police had no suspicions about him at the time. Stefano also explained that the reason he had previously kept the truth secret was because he feared that even if he confessed, the police would not be able to gather enough evidence to convict the other party. At that point, not only would justice be impossible to achieve, but his son could also be in danger. Now that his son is grown, and he can't bear to see his colleague continue murdering young couples, after much internal struggle, he finally decided to confess everything to the police. If Stefano's testimony is true, then his colleague is the one holding the murder weapon. It's highly likely he vented his hatred for Barbara's betrayal on women his own age, women who enjoy thrill-seeking in cars. That's why he committed the crimes repeatedly over the years, resulting in 4 consecutive murders. On the night the arrest warrant was announced, his colleague, who had just returned home, heard the news on the radio. He hastily packed his bags without explaining anything to his wife and drove away. He drove down a deserted forest road, used branches and leaves to cover his tracks, and began his escape. By the time the police arrived at his house, it was too late. The wife, accustomed to her husband's frequent mischief, immediately covered for him. She said that he had gone out for work a few days earlier and hadn't returned. However, the couple clearly underestimated the police's investigative techniques. The police installed a listening device in the house's telephone and quickly recorded a call the colleague made after he had settled into his hiding place. Almost effortlessly, the police tracked him down and arrested him. The situation was now completely unfavorable for the colleague because the police not only found the car hidden in the woods, but also discovered that he had purchased a .22 caliber Beretta pistol. However, the colleague still vehemently denied committing any murders. From his testimony, the police heard a different version of the story. Since 1967, he had been committing armed robberies. He always carried a Beretta pistol while working at construction sites under a false identity. He usually hid the gun under wooden planks in places where no one would notice. By chance, through working together on the same construction site as Stefano, he met the beautiful and seductive Barbara. From his first visit to her house, he couldn't control his wicked intentions. His acquaintance with Barbara made him feel even more disillusioned with his wife. Therefore, he began to find excuses to frequently visit Stefano's house. Ever since Barbara was offered to the tenant by her husband, she had become completely disillusioned with Stefano and fallen into depravity, so she didn't refuse when her husband's colleague slept with her. That day, Barbara opened up for the first time, confiding in him about her helplessness and despair at being violated by the tenant. He played the role of a perfect listener. When her hot tears fell, he hugged her tightly and swore he would never let her suffer any more harm. Their clandestine relationship gradually became public. Barbara held a mindset quite different from that of women in feudal times. She wore flamboyant, revealing clothes and brazenly kissed her lover in public. She was captivated by his possessive gaze and mistakenly believed it to be the love she was pursuing. However, one night while they were having dinner together, Stefano's brother happened to pass by and caught her in the act of adultery. His eyes, injured by a grinding machine, had been injured and he had to go home to recover. That very day, he witnessed his wife's infidelity firsthand. His patience began to crumble, yet he tried to remain calm, staying for dinner, his gaze never leaving Barbara, as if challenging her position in the family. His anger exploded and he pushed Barbara into the bedroom right in front of his colleague. Having considered marital relations a matter of course, he encountered fierce resistance from Barbara, and at this point, his colleague could no longer tolerate it. He burst through the door, grabbed Stefano by the collar, threw him off the bed, dragged him out of the room, and displayed his male prowess right in front of Barbara. Stefano once again succumbed to the domineering influence of another man, obediently preparing breakfast each morning and bringing it into the bedroom. The sight of 2 pale bodies intertwined was like a knife cutting into his eyes, but he could only swallow his humiliation and continue to be a coward. The turning point came one morning when, because his colleague hadn't returned home for a long time, his enraged wife brought the police to the house to find him. The colleague was eventually taken to the police station, charged with domestic violence and illegal cohabitation, and sentenced to 6 months in prison. During that time, Stefano Stefano, wanting to teach his disobedient wife a lesson, humbled himself to beg the tenant to return to the house. The moment Barbara saw the tenant, the deeply repressed memories surged violently. She panicked, ran straight into the bedroom, and locked the door. Stefano, now with someone backing him up, his anger swelled, and he finally unleashed all his accumulated resentment in a torrent of vulgar words. 6 months later, the colleague was released, and his first act was to find Barbara to rekindle their old relationship. Meanwhile, the tenant deliberately sowed discord, his words like a curse tightening around the colleague's mind. During their rare reunion, the red dress he once loved most now seemed utterly repulsive to him, especially the teasing glances from those around him, which only fueled his suspicion. In his eyes, Barbara was his personal possession, absolutely not to be coveted by anyone else. At this point, no matter how Barbara explained what she had been forced to endure while he was in prison, he no longer believed her. Not far away, a man was laughing and betting with his colleague that he could get into Barbara's bed within a week. Amidst that malicious laughter, Barbara clutched her torn clothes and sadly walked away. Those who were watching him realized that the man he was betting with was her new lover, who was later murdered along with Barbara. In 1982, after his colleague was arrested, he claimed that it was the last time he had seen Barbara. The police didn't believe this statement and summoned Stefano for questioning. Stefano confessed without hesitation that his colleague had forced him to participate in the murder of Barbara and her new lover that year. However, his colleague scoffed sarcastically, saying that Stefano didn't even know how to lie properly. The prosecutor then pulled out documents from the archives, revealing that before marrying his wife, this colleague had also pretended to be gentle. But in reality, to him, all women were just objects. He would fly into a rage at the slightest loss of control. After marriage, he dropped his disguise, repeatedly beating his wife to the point of serious injury without any remorse. The prosecutor conducted a simulation and analysis of the 1968 murder case and deduced that on that evening, his colleague had witnessed Barbara and her lover entering the movie theater, so he went home to retrieve his Beretta pistol. He also arranged to meet Stefano to seek revenge. The two followed Barbara to a secluded suburban area and without hesitation shot and killed both victims. The police also made it clear to the colleague that he coincidentally appeared near the scene of each murder. Furthermore, the alibis fabricated by his wife were completely unsubstantiated. From this, the police concluded he was the perpetrator of the serial murders and confidently sent him to prison. It seemed the final case was solved, but unexpectedly, just a year after his imprisonment, another couple parked in the woods for a private moment and were murdered. This was the 6th serial murder since 1968. From the victims to the murder weapon, everything was identical to the previous cases. The killer continued to commit murders, while his colleague, who was imprisoned, clearly had no opportunity to commit the crime. As soon as he was released, the police's patience was almost exhausted. They summoned Stefano to the police station again, presented him with each photograph of the victim, and angrily questioned him about why he had lied. 1959 was the beginning of all the tragedy, whether it was murder or marriage. Barbara, with her free-spirited personality and striking beauty, was always surrounded by all kinds of men. Stefano's family feared she would ruin the family's reputation, so they forbade her from going out. They also didn't allow her to wear any revealing clothing. Her sister-in-law even scolded her, saying that bars were places made for men, and that virtuous women would never set foot in such places. Barbara had barely managed to stand up and retort when Stefano's brother slapped her across the face with all his might. Throughout this whole ordeal, Stefano, as Barbara's husband, simply ate his meal with his head down, remaining silent. While Barbara was locked in her bedroom at home, her father-in-law, taking advantage of no one else being home, pretended to enter and inquire about her well-being. However, his disgusted gaze and filthy hands lingered on her body. Barbara refused to give in. She threatened her father-in-law with a teapot and demanded that he agree to let her and Stefano leave the family estate. Otherwise, she would expose everything that had just happened. Barbara seized upon this weakness, forcing her father-in-law to agree. He bought Stefano and his wife a new house. The entire family had used up all their savings. The only one who deeply resented this was Stefano's older brother. Time passed quickly, and before they knew it, it was 1984. The serial murders remained unsolved. That night, Stefano's brother, while the person next to him was asleep, secretly took a small knife from the bathroom and crept out of the house. He drove straight to Libra's house to pick her up and take her to the pub for their date. During their conversation, Stefano's brother spoke mysteriously to Libra, saying that the man in the pub had witnessed the second murder in 1981. After committing the crime, he dragged the woman's body out of the car and mutilated her genitals with a knife. However, fearing repercussions, the man didn't dare report it to the police. Furthermore, most of the men frequenting the pub were voyeurs, often hiding in the fields to watch couples on dates. It was possible that others had also seen the killer's face. To verify this speculation, Stefano's brother deliberately drove Libra across the fields. Sure enough, everywhere were voyeurs scrambling to get up and run away. When Libra recovered from her shock, she found the car had stopped in an even more secluded spot. Stefano's brother turned the steering wheel and once again mentioned the series of murders. He insisted that this was the scene of the first crime in 1974, where a couple had been murdered. He meticulously described the killer's entire modus operandi, including details never before released by the police. How did he know all this? This question exploded in Libra's mind like a bomb. But before she could react, her brother Stefano grabbed her hand, pulled her forcefully out of the car, causing her to fall face down on the grass. Then he pulled out a small knife wrapped in several layers of cloth and repeatedly stabbed her in the heart. Fortunately, Stefano's hand blocked the sharp point, making it look as if he were rehearsing the 96th stab. Libra was terrified, but Stefano didn't press the matter further. He quickly regained his usual calm demeanor. He carefully helped her back to the car and even brushed the grass off her clothes. Everything that had just happened seemed like a hallucination, but instead of taking Libra home, Stefano's brother drove her to a gloomy cemetery. No normal person could have such lustful thoughts in such an atmosphere. Yet Stefano's brother managed it. Libra panicked and pushed him away. Looking at his furious eyes, she only felt fear. He didn't say another word, but went around to the back of the car, opened the trunk, glanced at Libra, and then carried his belongings deeper into the cemetery. Only when his figure gradually disappeared into the night did Libra dare to get out of the car to check what was in the trunk. It turned out to be a blood-stained diary and a large, sturdy roll of rope. She didn't dare stay for even a second. While Stefano's brother hadn't returned yet, he frantically drove away to the nearest residential area. At dawn, the police finally arrived at Stefano's house to investigate. They also checked Stefano, who had been living there after serving his prison sentence. They found a piece of paper on him. After Stefano's brother was taken to the police station, the police presented all the evidence recovered from the car's trunk. He argued that the rope was just a tool kept in the trunk of his car, so what was wrong with that? As for the bloodstains on the diary, he claimed it was likely from accidentally cutting his hand. The police pointed out that Stefano's brother worked far from home and only returned during holidays. The fact that the murders always occurred just before his holidays made it impossible for him to provide a convincing alibi. Furthermore, the police knew he hated Barbara because she had squandered the Stefano family's fortune. He hated her even more for betraying his brother, bringing shame to the entire family. From this, they speculated that this was the motive behind his murder of Barbara in 1968. Afterward, he vented his hatred on any couple seeking thrills. A year after Barbara's murder, the police questioned Stefano's son, who was being housed in a welfare institution. The boy recounted, word for word, that he had personally seen Barbara and her new lover recline their chairs. Immediately afterward, the killer brutally murdered them. Besides the boy's father, there was another person directly involved in the crime, Stefano's friend, a baker. The note the police obtained was confirmed to be in Stefano's brother's handwriting. The content perfectly matched his son's testimony. Stefano's request for his son to name the baker was actually just a diversion to divert police attention away from his brother. He then instructed Stefano on how to shift all suspicion onto his colleague, simultaneously shielding the baker and making his colleague a scapegoat. It was a perfect move. Faced with this series of arguments, Stefano's brother remained completely silent. The police continued to re-examine the entire 1968 case and concluded that it was highly likely Stefano's brother had driven Stefano to the secluded suburbs, where they followed Barbara and ultimately committed the brutal murder. Despite the lack of decisive direct evidence, the police chose to convict Stefano's brother. The baker was also arrested for his involvement, and all were imprisoned. The police were essentially repeating their own mistake, because just days after these men were imprisoned, another young couple, believing the threat from the killer had ended, drove to a secluded suburban area. The killer, wielding a dagger, stabbed both victims multiple times. He then dragged the girl dozens of meters away and mutilated part of her body. That night, when the police discovered the bodies and reported it to their superiors, the officer in charge swallowed hard. Her hand trembled uncontrollably as she held the phone. A mixture of rage and helplessness weighed heavily on her, almost suffocating her. The truth proved that even Stefano's brother wasn't the man the police were looking for. With no other clues available, their only hope rested on the person who had clearly seen the killer's face. Barbara's case had been over 10 years old. Even though they tried to recreate the scene, Stefano's son could only apologetically tell the police that he was too young at the time. Both his father and uncle had taught him how to deal with the police. His memories were overlapping, so it was highly likely the clues he provided were no longer accurate. However, when he turned to look at the reeds, a surprising detail suddenly surfaced in his mind. On the night of the murder, those reeds had also rustled, as if someone had just passed by. Based on this new testimony, the police immediately searched the tenant's house. The room was messy, with belongings scattered everywhere, looking as if only one person lived there. There, the police found a blood-stained piece of cloth. There were traces of gunpowder on it, most likely used to clean a gun. The lodger chose to explain that the piece of cloth belonged to him and his former girlfriend, with whom he had lived. He claimed to have no knowledge of blood or gunpowder. The police continued to question him about the headlamp that had been found. Because dismembering a body usually requires the perpetrator to keep their hands free, a headlamp is essential. The lodger calmly justified his actions by saying he was a locksmith who often worked at night and needed a headlamp to keep his hands free. These items could not be considered incriminating evidence. Therefore, the police reluctantly released him temporarily, while simultaneously assigning someone to secretly monitor him. Looking back at the chaotic room, he saw the suspects being interviewed by the media on TV. Old memories flooded his mind. 1958 was the year the lodger was discharged from the army. The feeling of anticipation upon returning wasn't because of the village he had left so long ago, but because he was about to meet someone incredibly important. Their lovers were never apart. Their eyes met, causing long-suppressed emotions to erupt. Yet, in that conservative era, their relationship was taboo. If he married a woman impulsively, it meant he would never see her again for the rest of his life. From that, a dark idea arose. He began to set his sights on his girlfriend's younger sister. At that time, the girl was already engaged to another family and had strictly rejected his advances. But selfishly, for the sake of his own future, he disregarded everything, pushing his girlfriend's sister into a dark alley, forcing her to accept the situation. After the child was born, he completely abandoned his family and brazenly used the excuse of visiting his child to invite his ex-girlfriend to his house for dates. His wife received no attention, so she turned her affections to other men who were attracted to her. When the tenant caught him in the act of infidelity, he said nothing but returned home to wait for his wife. He silently scrutinized her with a scrutinizing gaze as if assessing prey. After the meal, he took the child from his wife's arms, placed it on the bed, and forcefully pushed her into the living room. He questioned her about her audacity in betraying him. She, unafraid, loudly declared she would expose his relationship with her brother. His rage consumed all reason. In a cruel decision, he not only murdered his wife but also disguised the scene as a suicide, imitating her handwriting to write a suicide note to mislead suspicion. However, the person who understood him best was his lover. With just a glance, he knew exactly what had happened. After breaking up with his lover, he moved to another city, renting a room in Stefano's house. During the contract negotiations, his gaze remained fixed on Stefano. Even when Stefano showed him the room and asked if he liked it, he couldn't take his eyes off her. That day, when Stefano returned home from work, the lodger sought an opportunity to approach him. Stefano didn't refuse. This unprecedented, unsettling feeling continued until Barbara burst through the door and witnessed the intimate scene. She froze, utterly disbelieving what she saw. The lodger feared Barbara would expose their relationship, so he continuously used manipulative tactics to make things difficult for her. Instilling fear in her was a minor matter. He understood perfectly well that to control a person's behavior, one must first control their body. Thus, with Stefano's tacit permission, the lodger entered his bedroom and without hesitation, extended his claws. His probing actions spiraled out of control. Even later, while Stefano was still present, the lodger brazenly made his move. Stefano, in turn, thoroughly enjoyed this urgent and unconventional relationship. He not only didn't object, but actively participated. It wasn't until 4 months after Barbara confessed her pregnancy that the tenant realized things were spiraling out of control. He absolutely refused to take responsibility and immediately packed his bags and left. It was then that Stefano realized he was merely a tool. He was there or not, it didn't matter. He could do whatever he wanted. Prosecutors searched the tenant's home and found a gun identical to the one used in the serial murders, but he argued it was just a coincidence. He claimed that since his second marriage, he had never intended to be involved with Barbara again. Therefore, the police summoned his ex-wife, who was considered the real victim in this marriage. At 18, having just fallen in love, she had been captivated by his deceptively polite demeanor. Her family strongly opposed the marriage, accusing him of domestic violence and suspecting him of murdering his first wife. But she became pregnant before marriage and resolutely left home to marry him. After getting married, he completely dropped his disguise. He didn't work to support the family. Instead, every night he would take his wife to the notorious red light district to solicit customers. Finally, one day, his wife could no longer bear that life. While he was out partying, she packed her bags, took her 2 children, and fled. Her first departure was in 1974, the same year the first series of murders involving randomly killed couples occurred. Perhaps because she was unhappy at home and had to raise the children alone, she was forced to return and reconcile with him. In 1980, she left a second time and never returned. Police speculate that it's highly likely that on that night in 1974, when he returned home and discovered his wife and children had left, the feeling of betrayal fueled his evil intentions. In that rage, he randomly murdered a couple seeking thrills in the wilderness. At the same time, he vented his anger by stabbing the victim 96 times. The police asked the former wife whether the alibi she provided on the night Barbara was murdered in 1968, when she had just married her tenant, was true or false. Then, the police showed her photographs of the victim from recent years. The shock was so great that she broke down mentally. She felt nauseous and rushed out of the police office. In September 1985, the serial killer struck again in the suburbs, murdering a couple and even cutting out their organs. He carefully placed them in an envelope. The next day, the killer sent the envelope to the prosecutor's address. The handwriting on the letter was cut and pasted from a printout, making it impossible to recognize. But when the prosecutor brought the contents to light and examined them, he immediately understood that this was a provocation from the murderer. The police immediately arrested the lodger, the sole suspect at time. However, he stubbornly refused to confess, and the police were unable to convict him. Nevertheless, through various lines of investigation, they had at least enough reason to believe he had murdered his first wife. Therefore, he was eventually detained awaiting legal punishment. But the trial dragged on until 1988. Because during his ambiguous relationship with Stefano, he had revealed that he had killed his wife, and the police couldn't gather more concrete evidence, they were forced to summon Stefano to testify in court. When reporters asked the lodger if he was satisfied with the acquittal, he replied that he was happy the truth had been revealed to the public. Since then, he has completely disappeared. Even today, in 2025, there has been no news of him. As for the terrifying killer hidden among the masses, no one knows who he truly is. The case has dragged on for 57 years. The victims were trapped in a bottomless abyss. Although many were later accused of being serial killers in Italy, all their accusations ended in despair. The film ends here. Goodbye, and see you again.